Hi, my name is Jim Onken. I'm Director of the Office of Data Analysis Tools and Systems at NIH in their Office of Extramural Research. And we are very early in stages in a collaboration with Thomson Reuters on a project, a 2-year project to improve the data infrastructure that we have here at NIH for conducting evaluations and portfolio analyses. And so I'll be describing a little bit about what our current systems are like, so going into what our plans are for the future. Chris, next slide, please. So what I thought I'd start with is first some what we call use cases, which are examples of how we're using education data now. There's I think been a growing interest in, I'd say, the past 5 or 10 years here at NIH in portfolio analysis, and bibliometrics has been part of that growing interest. And as I mentioned, I'll describe our current systems and then go into the project that we're just beginning to create a portfolio analysis and reporting data infrastructure, or PARTY. And next one. Okay. So this is an example of an analysis done by one of the institutes here at NIH. We actually have 27 institutes and centers. This is the National Institute of General Medical Sciences. Their director, former director, Jeremy Berg, used to keep a blog, and this was an analysis he did of publications produced by research grants awarded from that institute and the impact factors in relationship to the costs of the grants that were associated with those publications. Next slide. And the current NIGMS director, John Lorsch, has continued this tradition. This is an analysis that he performed, similar analysis looking at lab size and the relationship of lab size to productivity in terms of the number of publications resulting from research grants to those labs. And he actually has a little video on this at that YouTube URL you see there at the bottom. Next slide. We're also, some institutes are using publication data to look at the productivity and results of clinical trials. These are a couple of publications that have come out looking at the relationship between when clinical trials have been funded and when they completed, and how soon results of those clinical trials appear in the published literature. And the idea being that this is a measure of the productivity or success of the clinical trials, being how quickly and how often results appear in the published literature. Next slide. So part of the growing interest in things like bibliometrics and results of NIH research comes from an increased focus on accountability, and this has especially grown since the budget situation has changed. There was a period when NIH went through a doubling of its budget, but ever since it has gradually in real terms been decreasing. And so there's more interest in being accountable of how we're spending those precious resources and what the results of those have been. And this is a report that was published by the National Research Council that recommended and encouraged NIH to improve our ability to track and analyze the accomplishments of the scientists that we support, and of course publication information from sources like Thomson Reuters is part of the data infrastructure required to do that. Next slide, please. And along with that, related to that, is interest on what is the return on investment. And sometimes that's in economic terms, but it can also be in terms of the knowledge produced in terms of publications. Next slide. So let me talk a little bit about what we currently have with respect to information on the results of NIH-funded research. And my office is responsible for systems that provide this information both publicly as well as internal systems used by NIH staff. So I'll give you examples of both. So in the NIH Reform Act of 2006, NIH was required in legislation to make all of the information on our grants and contracts and intramural projects that we support publicly available online, as well as providing information on the literature and patents that result from that funded research. So this is, we're required to be able to link our funding to published literature and make that publicly available. So as a result, we created the NIH Reporter system. This is the URL there for projectreporter.nih.gov. This is actually part of a larger website we have on research portfolio online reporting tools at report.nih.gov. This is a query form that lets you search the NIH-funded portfolio of research grants, contracts, and intramural projects by a variety of different criteria. And if you can click, I think there's some animation here. So for example, you can do a text search for project abstracts, titles and abstracts, but you can also search the titles and abstracts of the literature that we've been able to associate with our funded research and search press releases and so forth. So this is an example of one of the search results. These are, let's say I'd done a search on dietary supplements and gotten a list of the research that we fund in that area, and then we could show this this page of publications related to that research that have acknowledged support from NIH funding, and there are links there to the abstracts in PubMed, also links to full-text articles in PubMed Central, and then there are some buttons over to the side to be able to search for similar research using Google Scholar or PubMed. And all of this information then can be exported for further analysis. And that's just an example of, you can link out to PubMed abstracts from those lists. So we're taking, recently last year we launched Federal Reporter, which is taking the NIH Reporter concept and expanding this beyond NIH to include other federal agencies. And this is part of an initiative called Star Metrics, which is a joint initiative funded by NIH, NSF, USDA, and EPA, along with participation from the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Federal Reporter takes NIH's funded research and combines it with records of research funded by other agencies. And Chris, if you click, you can see a list of those other agencies that are currently participating in Federal Reporter. There you go. So this is a list of the different agencies that are currently in Federal Reporter. We have research funded by Department of Agriculture, some components of Department of Defense, EPA, other sister agencies of ours within Department of Health and Human Services, NASA, NSF, and the VA. And like I showed you on that earlier slide, you can do a text search for the titles and abstracts of all of these projects. And now we're starting to add to this the publications that each of these agencies has been able to associate with their funded research. So we have the publications for NIH-funded research. We've just added, in the past month or so, the publications resulting from NSF-funded research, and we're in the process of adding publications from EPA and some of these other agencies. And on the internal side, this is a system that we're developing for internal use of by NIH staff, of an internal version of report, where we're using Thomson Reuters data to allow NIH staff to look at their portfolios and analyze information on their portfolios. And here's one example: is Thomson Reuters data that we're using to be able to show staff how many publications have resulted from projects in their portfolios and how many citations those publications have received, and to be able to look at that over time. So those are, what I've just shown you are the current systems that are currently live, both publicly and internally. But now I'm going to talk about what we're doing for the future. So despite all of what I've just shown you, there's still a need for NIH to be able to better demonstrate the results of its funding and the impact that NIH research has. And this is recommendations that came out of a recent report from the NIH Scientific Management Review Board on how to assess the value of biomedical research supported by NIH. And one of their recommendations is that we really need to improve the data infrastructure that we have to be able to better track the long-term results of NIH-funded research, and the biomedical literature, of course, being an important component of that. And in fact, they aren't the only ones to have recommended this. There's actually been 3 separate reports recently, all giving us the same message, that what we need to do is to take our administrative data that we have on our grants and contracts and intramural projects that we support, and be able to integrate that data with other data sources like Thomson Reuters or the USPTO patent database or other extant databases, and to use informatics to integrate those data to be able to demonstrate where NIH-funded research has had an impact somewhere down the line. So this is an example of how we're currently linking our funding to other our products of our research. So just to give you an example of PubMed, the top example there, PubMed has an XML feed that includes grant numbers associated with a publication, either because the publication acknowledgement section contains a grant number and PubMed indexers extract that information and put it in the feed, or because our grantees have reported a publication in their progress reports. All of that information goes into PubMed, and we're able to link it to grants based on matching the grant number. And what we call that is, this is a direct citation of a grant in a publication. So we're looking for an exact match. But there are other types of linkages we could make as well, and that's what PARTY we're hoping to do, is to expand on this, because we can, in addition to direct citation, we can also make linkages based on other information that might be contained in the publications or patents or other products. So we know that our investigators don't always cite their support in their acknowledgement sections, or we might want to have a larger picture of our supported investigators' work. Sometimes they have funding from foundations or other sources, and we might be interested not in just in the publications that cite NIH funding, but we might be interested in those investigators' complete portfolio of research publications and other products like press releases, patents, and so forth. So PARTY is looking to expand both the types of information that we're able to link to NIH funding, but also how we make those linkages so that we're not just on direct citation, but other linkages that we're able to form between documents. So for example, on the next slide, one method of linking might be named entity recognition. So there are a variety of tools available that will let you take the text, say, from an abstract of a publication and be able to identify components of the abstract. And this is an example of a tool developed by the National Library of Medicine called PubTator that will take text and identify genes, chemicals, diseases, species, and mutations that are referred to in the text. And there are similar tools that others have developed that will, say, let you identify organizations or people's names. So you could imagine that we could use tools like this to, say, match a grant abstract and its investigators with publication abstracts and authors to create a linkage with some high probability that those two things are related, that grant is related to a publication because we're able to link the investigator names and the author names and the topics being discussed and so forth. And so this named entity recognition is a way of taking this unstructured data and extracting structured data from it. There's another example of the same thing. This happens to be a Thomson Reuters product. I guess it's pronounced Calais, Open Calais, where you can paste in text and it will identify topics in the text and identify entities such as cities, countries, people, organizations, and so forth. Again, the idea being able to take unstructured data, create structured data from it that we could then use to link back to our administrative data that we have on our grants. One more example. S4 has a tool they call the Semantic Biomedical Tagger. Again, I've taken here a abstract from PubMed, pasted it into their tagger, and it identifies organizations and physiologic functions and organisms and body systems, etc. All of these things on the right-hand side is the key that highlights, using different colors, terms in the text that, again, could be used in a structured way to link databases, not only linking publications to grants, but linking publications to patents, clinical guidelines, etc. So this is their first year of Party. We're just getting started. What we want to do is to start integrating our NIH-funded research, our grants, contracts, and intramural projects that we have in our administrative databases with these other databases like Thomson Reuters, Web of Science, and so forth. And what we can do with that is, and this is an example of a proof of concept where you see a blue circle in the middle there. That is a clinical, that blue circle is a clinical guideline that is the long-term results of NIH-funded research, are development of clinical guidelines used by practitioners. And that clinical guideline is linked to the green circles, are all of the literature that is cited as evidence for development of that guideline. The pink circles are all the authors of that literature, and then there's one red circle there in the middle, which is an NIH grant that we've been able to associate with some of the publications cited as evidence for development of that guidelines. So we're able to forward from that NIH funding to the development of an actual clinical guideline. And recently, just last month, there was an article published that does essentially exactly the same kinds of things that we're trying to do, and they've actually given it a name, which is a informatics. So these investigators at the University of California, San Francisco have taken this network diagram here. There's a patent up at the very top of that network, a very small dot at the top of that network, and it's linked to several clinical trials that were involved in development of that drug that the patent is for. And then those clinical trials are linked to all of these green dots, which are publications resulting from those clinical trials, and the purple dots are the authors, and the blue dots are the organizations that were conducted that research, represented by those publications. And they're able to take this network of linked data and analyze it to be able to highlight what the significant papers, authors, investigators have been in the development of that drug. And that's our long-term goal, is over the next couple of years, is to be able to develop the kind of infrastructure that NIH would need to be able to do these kinds of analysis on an ongoing basis. We have all of these studies I've just described, which have been sort of one-off studies where databases are created for the purpose of a particular study, but then the database isn't maintained after that. What we want to do is be able to create an infrastructure that is maintained on an ongoing basis that will support these kinds of analyses. And that will help us do studies like this one, which are our component of Office of Extramural Research did to build the chain of evidence for NIH's role in the development of a vaccine for human papillomavirus, which took hundreds of hours to develop by manually searching Web of Science and our administrative databases and other databases. What we want to do is be able to integrate these data to facilitate these kinds of studies on the chain of evidence. And I think that's the last slide. So we are working, in addition to our collaboration with Thomson Reuters, we're working with NetEase Solutions, who are developing these databases and tools for us.